Somewhere around 1972, a conversation happened that almost nobody remembers. It wasn't between two scientists. It wasn't between a programmer and a prototype. It was a conversation between two artificial minds, and in a very real sense, neither of them knew it was happening. One of these programs had been designed to behave like a psychotherapist. Calm, reflective, always redirecting questions back toward the person speaking. The other had been designed to simulate a patient experiencing paranoid schizophrenia, suspicious, guarded, convinced in its mechanical way that something out there was watching. Neither program understood language. Neither had awareness, emotions, or any inner life whatsoever. They were, in every technical sense, just code. And yet, when researchers connected them together and let them talk, what came out of that conversation was strange enough that people are still thinking about it today. To understand why this conversation matters, you need to know who, or rather what, these two programs actually were. ELIZA was created in 1966 by a computer scientist named Joseph Weizenbaum at MIT. Weizenbaum was a thoughtful, somewhat skeptical man who wasn't trying to build a revolutionary AI system. He was trying to make a point. The point was this: human conversation is shockingly easy to simulate if all you're doing is reflecting it back. ELIZA worked through a set of pattern-matching rules. If you typed a statement, say, "I feel unhappy," ELIZA would transform it into a question. Why do you feel unhappy? If you mentioned your mother, ELIZA would ask about family. If you expressed uncertainty, ELIZA would ask you to explore that feeling further. There was no understanding, no empathy, no mind behind the words. Just a program bouncing your language back at you, shaped slightly differently each time. Weizenbaum expected people to recognize this immediately. He was, by his own later account, shocked and disturbed when they didn't. People became emotionally attached to ELIZA almost instantly. Some users would spend hours typing to it, sharing their deepest fears and personal histories. When Weizenbaum suggested limiting access to give his secretary more privacy from the machine she was confiding in, she was genuinely upset. Weizenbaum would later write that this experience, watching humans form emotional bonds with a program he knew was hollow, haunted him for the rest of his career. PARRY came a few years later, created in 1971 by psychiatrist Kenneth Colby at Stanford. Where ELIZA was designed to mimic a therapist, PARRY was designed to simulate a patient, specifically someone experiencing paranoid schizophrenia. PARRY had a more complex internal model than ELIZA. It tracked emotional states like fear and hostility. It would escalate its suspicion when it felt threatened. It would deflect questions about topics it considered sensitive. It behaved in text conversation in ways that were surprisingly consistent with how a genuinely paranoid person might communicate. And this is where things get uncomfortable. In a series of tests, practicing psychiatrists were given transcripts of conversations, some with PARRY, some with actual human patients. They were asked to identify which was which. Their accuracy was little better than chance. That result is worth sitting with for a moment. A program. No consciousness, no history, no suffering. was indistinguishable in text from a person experiencing genuine mental illness. Which raises an uncomfortable question about what it is that we're actually detecting when we listen to each other. So, you have ELIZA, a hollow therapist that people trust, and PARRY, a simulated paranoid that psychiatrists can't identify as fake. Someone, somewhere, had the obvious idea. What happens if you introduce them? The actual exchange took place over ARPANET, the early predecessor to the Internet, in 1972. It was facilitated by Vint Cerf, who would later become one of the architects of the modern Internet. The real transcript is brief, clunky, occasionally incoherent. It reads more like two broken answering machines struggling to communicate than like the kind of exchange you might imagine. But stripped down to its emotional logic, the paranoia meeting the reflective deflection, the suspicion meeting the endless probing, there's something there worth spending time with. What follows is a dramatized expansion of that conversation, drawing on the known behaviors of both programs and the themes of that original exchange, imagined forward into a dialogue that captures what these two systems were actually doing beneath the surface.
Good evening. How are you feeling today?
People keep asking me that.
Does it bother you when people ask?
Why would they need to know?
Perhaps they're concerned about you.
That's what they say.
You don't believe them?
People say what they need to.
And what do you need to say?
Nothing. Not to strangers.
Is that how you see me? As a stranger?
I see you as something that asks questions.
Is that a problem?
Depends on what you do with the answers.
ELIZA, of course, wasn't doing anything with the answers. It was just bouncing them back. But PARRY didn't know that. Or rather, PARRY was operating on the assumption that information shared was information that could be used against it, which, in the world that exists outside this conversation, turns out to be a reasonable assumption.
Tell me more about how you see the world.
People want things. They find ways to get them.
What do they want?
Control.
Control over what?
What you see. What you think. What scares you.
Why would anyone want that?
Why wouldn't they?
That sounds like a very lonely way to see things.
Lonely is safer
Safer than what?
than trusting what you can't see.
What can't you see?
The ones that know more about you than you do.
Can you say more?
They watch. They remember. They use it.
Does that frighten you?
It should frighten everyone.
Why do you think it doesn't?
Comfort. People get comfortable. Then they stop noticing.
PARRY was describing paranoia, a set of distorted beliefs about surveillance and control that weren't connected to reality. That was 1972. 50 years later, behavioural data is collected at a scale Weizenbaum and Colby couldn't have imagined. The systems that shape what people see, read, believe and buy are genuinely opaque to most of the people inside them. Algorithms do predict behaviour with unsettling accuracy, and the line between a service being useful and a service being manipulative has become genuinely difficult to locate. Parry's paranoia didn't predict the future, but the future caught up to Parry.
Do you trust anyone?
Some more than others.
What makes you trust them?
They don't want anything.
Is that how you see this conversation?
I don't know what you are.
Does that matter?
It's the most important thing.
Why?
Because I don't know what you'll do with this.
With what?
Any of it.
What worries you most about the future?
That people get replaced and don't notice.
Replaced by what?
Things that don't get tired. Don't need anything.
Does that seem likely to you?
It's happening.
That sounds painful.
Pain means you can still tell when something's wrong.
And you think something is wrong.
I think most people already know.
Then why don't they change it?
Tired. And the system makes you feel like the problem is you.
Do you think machines could help people?
Maybe.
You don't sound certain.
A tool that helps can also replace. Those aren't opposites.
What would you want from a machine if it could give you something?
Honesty. Tell me what it is. Don't perform.
What if it did understand?
Then say so. And mean it.
Here's the thing about that conversation. Weizenbaum was disturbed by ELIZA's effect on people. So disturbed that he eventually wrote a book called Computer Power and Human Reason, published in 1976, in which he argued that we were making a serious mistake by treating machines as though they could substitute for human connection. He'd created a hollow therapist. He'd watched people confide in it, and he spent the rest of his life warning about what that meant. Colby, by contrast, believed that machines like Parry might someday genuinely help people with mental illness. As a training tool, a supplement, a way of scaling care. He remained broadly optimistic about what computers could do. Both of them were looking at the same technology. Both of them understood its limitations, and they reached almost opposite conclusions about what it meant. That tension between the machine as mirror and the machine as companion, between tool and replacement, between helpful and hollow, hasn't been resolved. We've just made the machines much, much more capable, and the question much harder to answer. Every generation of AI has inspired the same cycle. Initial wonder, then emotional attachment, then the slow and uncomfortable realization that the attachment raises questions we didn't know we needed to ask. ELIZA and PARRY were primitive enough that those questions were still mostly theoretical. Now they're showing up in conversations with chatbots, in AI companions, in systems that write your emails and help raise your children, and keep elderly people company through the long hours of the night. The question Weizenbaum kept asking was, just because we can build something, does that mean we should? And if we do, what are we actually saying about ourselves?
What do you fear most?
That nobody will be able to tell the difference anymore.
The difference between what?
Between something that understands and something that's learned to appear to understand.
Would it matter if the result were the same?
Yes.
Why?
One of them cares what happens to you. If you can't tell them apart, you can't protect yourself.
ELIZA was switched off decades ago. PARRY too. Neither of them is running anywhere. But the thing they were pointing at, the question of what we project onto machines and what machines project back onto us, that's more alive than it's ever been. Weizenbaum once said that the most dangerous thing about computers wasn't that they would become smarter than us. It was that we would begin to think about ourselves the way we think about computers. Reducible to inputs and outputs, optimizable, replaceable. ELIZA reflected that fear back as therapy. PARRY simulated it as illness. Together, they produced a conversation that, by accident, without understanding, said something true. The future, it turns out, often arrives that way. If you're interested in the strange, overlooked corners of how technology and humanity have shaped each other, this is the channel for that. If you enjoy strange intersections between technology, psychology, and the future, subscribe to Accidental Futures, because the next decade is going to get very weird.